The night I found out, I was standing in my own kitchen holding a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. My wife, the woman I had loved for 6 years, the woman I had built everything with, was sitting at the table, and she wasn't crying. That was the part that destroyed me. She wasn't crying. She was just looking at me with those steady gray eyes like she was waiting for a verdict she had already rehearsed accepting. She said my brother's name, and then she said the words that came after it. And the cup hit the floor before I even knew my hand had let go of it. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of the story. I am not a man who falls apart easily. I grew up in a back-to-back terrace on Inkerman Street in Coventry, the kind with a shared yard and a tin bath you dragged in on Fridays and a privy at the bottom of the garden that froze solid every January. My father came back from the First War a quieter man than he had left, and what the First War hadn't taken from him the foundry finished off, and he was gone before I was 11. My brother Robert was 9. My mother took in washing and later found work at the munitions factory on the Canal Road, and she kept us fed and shod and never once let on how close to the edge we were, because letting on was not something women of her generation did. You did not make a scene on Inkerman Street. You did not break things. You cleaned up the mess and you kept going. So when I say the cup hit the floor, what I really mean is that something in me broke so quietly and so completely that the only evidence was the sound of it on the flagstone and the spreading dark stain of tea across the kitchen floor my wife had scrubbed that same morning. Her name is Margaret. My wife. 5'3". Dark hair she pins up for church and lets down on Sundays when there's nowhere to be, a laugh I can carry across a pub garden. She works the till of the cooperative on Spawn Street 2 mornings a week and spends the rest of her time keeping our small house on Raglan Road in the kind of order that makes it feel larger than it is. I met her at a dance at the Coventry Hippodrome in the spring of 1946, the year after I came home from Germany. She was there with her friend Vera, and she stepped on my foot during a foxtrot and apologized 3 times, and I told her on the 4th that she owed me at least one more dance by way of restitution. She laughed and gave it to me. We courted for a year and a half, and I proposed on a Tuesday evening on the towpath along the canal, because I had saved up the ring money for 11 months, and I couldn't wait until the weekend. Robert is 2 years younger than me. He was too young for the Second War. By the time his papers would have come, he was working the reserved occupation at the Standard Motor Company, which suited him and suited my mother, who could not have stood losing us both. He has always been 2 years younger in every way that matters. 2 years less cautious, 2 years less patient, 2 years less afraid of consequence. Growing up, he was a charming one, the one who could talk his way out of trouble with the schoolmaster, into a game of cards with men twice his age, out of a fight that was entirely his own fault. My mother adored him in that helpless way mothers sometimes adore the child who worries the most. I was the steady one. Robert was the one who made life interesting. We had found a rhythm in that, a way of being brothers at work because we each understood our part. He was at our wedding at St. Michael Cathedral. What remained of it? They held the ceremony in the undercroft because the nave was still bomb damaged and the rebuilding hadn't begun in earnest. He gave a speech that made the women dab their eyes and the men laugh into their beer, which is the hardest thing to pull off at a wedding breakfast in a church hall, and he did it without effort, which is Robert. He was at our housewarming on Raglan Road when we moved in the following spring. He had supper with us most Sundays. He knew which drawer we kept the rent book in. He had a key to the house when Margaret locked herself out, which she did twice in the first year. He had a key to our house. Let me say that again. He had a key to our house. Margaret told me everything at that kitchen table, and she told it to me in a way that was measured and complete, like she had been rehearsing the delivery for weeks, because she had. She had been carrying this for 4 months before she sat me down. 4 months. Which meant for 4 months I had kissed my wife goodbye in the mornings, called in on my brother on weekends, eaten my supper in this kitchen, slept in this bed, and not known. For 4 months I had been the last man alive to know the thing that was most about me. It started, she said, during a long stretch when the factory was putting me on nights. I had been on the night shift at the Humber Works for 6 weeks running that winter. The firm had a lorry contract to fill, and the foreman wasn't shy about who he put on the unsocial hours. I came home at 6:30 in the morning, grey with exhaustion, slept until 2, ate whatever was on the stove, and went back. We barely saw each other. She said she was lonely. She said Robert came round one afternoon to return a tool he had borrowed from the shed. She said one afternoon became another. She said she didn't know how it happened. which is a thing people always say when they know precisely how it happened but cannot bring themselves to describe the sequence of small decisions that led there, because naming the decisions means naming the agency, and naming the agency means naming the fault. She was 11 weeks gone when she told me. I left the house that night. I put on my coat and my cap, and I walked. There was no car. We didn't have a car and wouldn't until 1954. I just walked. Down Raglan Road and along the Radford Road and out past the allotments and across the waste ground where the Daimler Shadow factory had stood before they demolished it after the war. I walked until my legs ached, and then I sat on a low wall outside of Rower Prefabs on the Tile Hill estate, the kind the council had thrown up in a hurry to house the bombed-out families, and I watched the dog cross the road and disappear under a gate, and I sat there until the cold came up through the wall and into my bones. I did not go to Robert's lodgings. I did not go to my mother's house. I walked home before dawn, let myself in quietly, and sat in the kitchen until the milkman came at 5, and then I washed my face at the kitchen sink and went to work. That is the kind of man I am. Or was. I no longer know with any certainty. For 3 weeks I existed in a state that I can only describe as suspended. I went to work. I came home. I ate food I could not taste. Margaret moved carefully around me, giving me space the way you give space to someone carrying something they might drop. She did not beg. She did not press. She made meals and left them on the stove, and sometimes sat in the front room in the evenings with her mending while I read the paper, or held the paper without reading it, and we existed together in a silence that was not peaceful but was at least contained. I slept on my side of the bed because there was nowhere else to sleep, and because some part of me, the part one I'm not proud of, kept thinking that if I could get through the next hour, the next morning, something would clarify. Robert came to the factory gate on day 10. He had never done that in his life. One of the lads came to find me on the floor and said, "There's a fellow outside says it's your brother," and I took off my work gloves and walked out to the gate, and I did not look at his face. I looked at the road. I said, "You have 1 minute." He said he was sorry. He said it was the worst thing he had ever done. He said he had been in a bad way. And I did not dignify that with a response, because I have also been in a bad way. I came back from Germany in the spring of 1945, having seen things I will not describe here, and I was in a bad way for longer than I told anyone, and I never once did what Robert had done. He cried. Robert, who had not cried at our father's funeral, who had stood dry-eyed in the cemetery on the London Road on a grey October afternoon with his cap in his hands. He stood at the factory gate and wept, and I watched the road and felt nothing. Or felt something so enormous that it collapsed into nothing, which is a different thing but looks the same from the outside. When he stopped, I said, "Go home, Robert." He went. He pushed notes through the letterbox for the next 2 weeks, folded pieces of paper with his handwriting on them, and I put them in the kitchen drawer without reading them, and there they stayed. Here is what nobody tells you about a betrayal like this. The ordinary life is the worst part. Not the shock. The shock is at least decisive. At least legible. What comes after is harder, because what comes after is ordinary life with a landmine buried in the middle of it. You are drinking your morning tea, and suddenly you are thinking about it. You are on the factory floor, and you lose the count on the gauge because your mind has gone somewhere you didn't send it. You are fine, and then you are not fine, and then you are fine again, and the cycling between those two states is exhausting in a way that leaves no mark on your face and that nobody around you can see. Margaret began to show at 5 months. There was a specific Tuesday morning. I remember it because there was a hard frost and the kitchen window had ice on the inside, which happened every winter, and I had come down early to get the range going. When I saw her standing at the worktop with her hand resting on her stomach the way women rest their hands on their stomachs when the life inside them has become undeniable, that unconscious cradling. And I stood at the foot of the stairs in my socks and vest, and I felt something move through me that I could not name then and still cannot name with precision. It was grief. Something closely adjacent to grief. It was a recognition that this was real, that a child was real, that this specific child was real, that they were coming and would be here and would be part of this world in which I also had to exist, and there was no future in which that was not true. She saw me standing there. She took her hand away from her stomach. She said, "Morning." I said, "Morning." I saw to the range. We did not speak about it. We had become very practiced by then at not speaking about it. But that evening she asked me to sit with her, and I sat, and she said, "There is something I've been afraid to say to you." I said, "Go on then." She said, "I want to keep this baby. I want to raise this child." And I am asking. She stopped here, and this is a pause I will carry with me for the rest of my life, because it was everything she had never allowed herself to ask for. I am asking if you will stay, not just in the house. I am asking if you will stay. She said it was not a fair thing to ask. She said she knew it wasn't fair. She said she had no right to ask it, that she had surrendered that right, that she would not blame me if the answer was no. But she asked because she said she had to know, because she said she still loved me, which was a thing I had not allowed myself to think about, because it was the most complicated piece of the whole impossible puzzle. She still loved me. And here is the monstrous, confusing, entirely human truth of it. I still loved her, not in the way I had loved her before. That version of the love was finished. You cannot unknow what I knew. You cannot stop the pictures your mind makes without permission, the unwanted film it plays at 3 a.m. in the dark. You cannot return to before. But there was something still present underneath the wreckage, the way there are always foundations under rubble. Coventry had taught us all that much. Something that had survived because it had gone too deep to be killed. I did not answer her that night. I asked for more time. She gave it to me without a word. I went to see Robert 3 weeks after that. I walked to his lodgings on Corporation Street, up the stairs that always smelled of boiled cabbage and pipe tobacco, and I knocked on his door. When he opened it, he had the look of a man waiting to hear how long he had left, which I suppose he was. I came in. I sat in the chair by the window. He sat on the bed. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Then I said, I need to understand something. Not for your benefit. For mine. I need to understand what I'm supposed to do with the rest of my life if you are in it, and what I'm supposed to do with the rest of my life if you're not. Because at present I don't know how to manage either one. He said he had no answer to that. He said everything he had pushed through my letterbox over the past months had been inadequate because there was no adequate thing to say. He said he was not going to ask for my forgiveness because he hadn't owned the right to ask. He said if I decided to be done with him, he would understand and he would not trouble me again. He said if I decided otherwise, he would spend the remainder of his life being the man he ought to have been. I said nothing to that. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I stood up, put my cap on, and said I would let him know. And I walked back down the stairs that smelled of cabbage and tobacco and out into the cold street. I spent a week after that doing something that would sound peculiar if I described it to anyone. Every evening after the day shift, I walked to Raglan Road Recreation Ground, the park where Robert and I had spent our boyhood Saturdays, where there was an old drinking fountain with a lion's head that hadn't worked since before the war, and a bandstand the council hadn't found the money to repair since the bombing. I sat on a bench near the bandstand, and I thought, not in any useful or organized way. I just sat and let whatever needed to come to the surface. Come, what came, in the end, was this: the rest of my life was mine to shape. I had choices, even when every one of them was hard. Leaving was a legitimate choice. Staying was also a legitimate choice. Neither made me a fool. Neither made me a saint. The question of Robert and the question of Margaret were separate questions, even though they had been lashed together by what happened between them, and I could answer them separately, and the answers were not required to match. I could forgive Margaret and not forgive Robert. I could eventually forgive Robert and still keep my distance. I could do both. I could do neither. But the life, my life, the one I actually wanted to live, that was the thing I needed to decide from. Not from the wound. From the life I wanted. I came home on a Friday evening in November, and Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table darning a sock by the light of the single bulb, and she looked up when I came in. I stood in the doorway with my coat still on and my cap in my hand, and then I said, I'm staying. She set down the darning. She did not speak immediately. I said, I'm staying, and I need you to hear what that means. It means we build something different from what we had before. Not the same thing repaired, something new, with different terms. There are things I will need from you that you will have to give me steadily and without complaint for a long time before I can trust them. There will be nights when I am not all right, and I need you to let me not be all right without trying to put it right before it's ready to be put right. And this child, I stopped here because this was the hardest sentence I had ever had to form. This child is not mine, but they are coming, and I will need to work out, as we go, what I am to them and what they are to me, and I cannot tell you how that will look because I genuinely do not know yet. But I am staying. I am choosing to stay with my eyes fully open, which means I am also choosing to try. She was crying crying in a way she had not cried on the night she told me, which told me the relief in her was enormous, which told me she had been carrying the weight of my possible leaving every single day for months, and that was its own kind of suffering I had not fully reckoned with until I watched it leave her face. I will not tell you it was easy after that. It was not. There were rows that were really about the other thing. There were silences with a weight in them. There was an evening in January when I found one of Robert's old notes in the kitchen drawer where I had put them unread, and I read it, and I put my coat on and walked for 2 hours in the dark and the rain and came home soaked through, and Margaret heated water for me without a word, and neither of us spoke of it for 3 days, and then we spoke of it for the better part of a night, and it was the worst conversation I have ever sat through, and also, in some way I was not expecting, a necessary one. The child was born on a Thursday morning in March 1951. A girl, 5 pounds 12 ounces. The midwife came to the house. That was how it was done in our street. A district nurse in the bedroom and the neighbors knowing by the sound of it. I was in the front room with a cold cup of tea and the wireless turned low, and when the midwife came downstairs and told me I could go up, I sat for another minute before I did. I stood in the bedroom doorway and Margaret was propped against the pillows holding her, and the morning light was coming through the curtains the way winter light comes through thin curtains, pale and clear and without warmth, and there was something in the room that I cannot put a proper name to. Not peace, exactly. Something more like the feeling you get when something becomes undeniably real, larger than you had been steeling yourself for. This was a person who had not existed yesterday and existed today. And everything that had brought her here, the catastrophe of it, the betrayal, the long grinding months of learning to live inside a broken thing, all of it had also brought her here, and she had no knowledge of any of it, and she was entirely innocent of it, and she was looking at the ceiling with the vague, wondering eyes of someone who had just arrived and was trying to take the measure of the place. I walked in. I sat on the edge of the bed. Margaret asked, quietly, if I wanted to hold her, and I said yes. I held her. I do not know what I am to her yet. I know I am not her father. Robert is her father, and that is something he will have to navigate on terms still being determined, in conversations still to be had, on a road none of us can see the end of yet. But I was in that room on the morning she came into the world. I am still in this house on Raglan Road. I am still in this marriage, the new one, the one with different foundations, the one we are building from more honest materials than the first. My mother came round on the Sunday. She sat across from me in the front room while Margaret was resting, and she looked at me for a long moment in the way she had looked at me since I was a boy whenever she wanted the truth and not the performance of it. She said, "How are you?" I said, "Managing." She said, "The truth." I said, "Some days I'm managing. Some days I'm not." She nodded slowly. She said, "That is the truth." She said, "You are a better man than your father was." I said, "I am not doing this to be a better man." She asked, "Then what for?" And I thought about it for a genuine minute. Not the answer that sounds well, but the one that was actually true. And I said, "Because when I imagined walking out of this house for good, the life I pictured was smaller than the one I'm in. Even with all of it broken, even knowing everything I know, the life I'm in is larger." She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached over and patted my hand the way she used when I was small, and had hurt myself, and she hadn't the words but wanted me to know she was present. Then she said the kettle was probably boiled by now, and she got up and went to make the tea. I thought about what it means to choose something damaged over something unencumbered. I thought about the bench by the old bandstand and the Lion's Head fountain that hadn't worked since before the war, and the back-to-back on Inkerman Street, and my mother's hands red from the washing, and my father who came home from the summer quieter man, and never recovered his full self, and Robert who wept at the factory gate, and Margaret who looked at me across a kitchen table without crying because she had already made her peace with losing me before she had finished speaking. And I thought, we are all, every single one of us on every terrace and every street in every bombed and rebuilt city in this exhausted country, just people trying to work out what to do with the hands we were dealt. And sometimes we play them badly. And sometimes we play them with more decency than anyone expected of us. And sometimes we just sit for a moment and stare at them, because the stakes are real and the cost is real, and there is no version of the game you walk away from without leaving something behind. I stayed. I don't know if I was right. I don't know if there is a right. I know I am still here. I know her name is June, because Margaret chose it for the month she had hoped all along the child would arrive in, though she came 3 months later, in the cold. I know June is 8 weeks old now and has begun to do something with the corners of her mouth that is not quite a smile, but is heading toward one. I know that when she does it, something in me responds before I have time to tell it not to. I know Robert and I have spoken twice since she was born. Brief conversations. Careful ones. Two men who used to share a bedroom on Inkerman Street, feeling their way along the edges of whatever we are now. Not nothing. Not what we were. I know that every morning I wake up in this house and I make a choice. That is a thing nobody warned me about. Decisions like this one are not made once. They are made every morning. You do not choose and then rest. You choose, and then you choose again, and then you choose again, and what those daily choices eventually build, if you are steady and honest and present enough, is a life. I do not know if that life will be a happy one. I believe it can be. I believe there are things still available to me, to us, that are worth the effort of reaching for. I believe June deserves a house that is at least trying to hold itself together. I believe Margaret is trying, in ways I can see even on the days I do not want to see them, to become a woman she can stand to be. I believe, and this is a belief I hold most carefully, because it is the most fragile of the lot, that what I chose freely. Not from weakness, not from want of the courage to go, but because, standing on the far side of the worst year of my life, I looked at what remained in the rubble and decided it was worth rebuilding. We had all learned that much, at least from the war. I stayed, and for now, that is enough.